The G20 is a fascinating case study of multilateral cooperation and collective problem solving. In its current form, as a summit-level forum, the G20 was elevated by the recent economic crisis. However, after 4 years, questions remain about the effectiveness and sustainability of G20 leadership.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm David Shorr of the Stanley Foundation. I will start, as people have been doing, by thanking Asan for bringing us together. I appreciate being included, and also such an excellent conference that Asan has organized, and also a very punctual one. I've noticed. We just started on time at 9 o'clock. We were ended yesterday on time at 9 o'clock at dinner. I go to a lot of conferences, as many of you do, I'm sure. I also host a lot of conferences, and I've really been struck that not only is this extremely well organized, but I've been especially impressed with the panelists for all of the sessions. Really a perfect lineup of experts for every one of the topics. Of course, the most impressive set of experts is the one we have here at this session. In all seriousness, I have worked with all three of this morning's panelists, and I'm grateful that all three of them have been participants in Stanley Foundation programs on the topic. To give you a little bit of introductory background on my colleagues, Ambassador An Ho-young is a career diplomat. He served in the run-up to the Korean-hosted G20 summit as a Sherpa for the consultative and outreach process and the preparations. And Ambassador An's next assignment very soon will be in Washington as the Korean ambassador to the United States. So I will be one more American to say how glad I am about your posting and wish you all the best and look forward to working with you in that capacity.
Thank you so much.
My friend Tom Wright is a fellow at the Brookings Institution's Managing Global Order project. He was previously executive director of studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which is just down the road from the Stanley Foundation in Chicago. Tom is very widely published, including work and articles that we've done together, the two of us. And then Liqun is one of China's leading experts on foreign affairs and foreign policy, is the professor of international studies and vice president of the China Foreign Affairs University, which is the professional training institution for the foreign ministry. She's also deputy editor of the Journal of Foreign Affairs Review, and among her other publications, I particularly recommend a piece that she did for the European Union's ISS on China's foreign policy. I'm going to start our session just by quickly laying out three assumptions, propositions, whatever you want to call them, and then my colleagues are going to pick up and I'm going to pose some questions to them. I want to say, first of all, that to judge the success for a multilateral organization or a group like the G20, the criteria is whether that organization or that forum is spurring governments to do things on behalf of the international common good that those governments would not otherwise do. Okay? So that's our main criteria of judgment of success or failure. As a broad description for where the G20 finds itself, I would say that the G20 is struggling to show results in terms of all of the effort that goes into the process, or at least that it is struggling to impress observers and onlookers and critics with the results that it is showing. And then a third point, I want to note a key duality in the identity of the G20. we're all familiar, I think, with the G20 as an economic coordination forum. This is where the 20 major economies together are stewards of the global economy, the globalized economy. But what we sometimes, I think, forget is that the G20 is also the place where rising powers and established powers come together as peer equals. That is, it is a new forum in terms of meeting at the world leader level, and it was very much in response to the need for rising and established powers to have a place where they could work together. It is interesting that it happens to be in the economic sphere, and we can talk about that. Now, turning to my colleagues here, as I mentioned, Ambassador An has been deeply involved with the G20 in its recent years, including playing a leading role in outreach and preparation for the 2010 Seoul Summit. How do you think the G20 is coming along? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? What will make the difference?
Well, to say the conclusion first, I'm very optimistic. And I have to say, I may not be the most neutral observer in the sense that I worked so closely with the G20. But apart from that, I think there are many reasons why I feel optimistic about the G20. And let me try to elaborate. If we review the measures taken by the G20 over the past several years, then there were some short-term measures and there were some long-term measures. By short-term measures, I mean the kind of measures G20 leaders agreed to take in the aftermath of financial crisis in 2008. And then they agreed to take those measures. They were emergency measures. And the reason why they agreed to take those measures was because they were genuinely concerned about hard crash of world economy. So they agreed to adopt fiscal policy, additional fiscal measures to the tune of 3% of GDP. And they also agreed on equally assertive monetary policy. And they also agreed upon creating additional $1 trillion liquidity for the world economy. And all of them helped. So much so that let us just think about the world trade. World trade, it shrank in 2009. It was the first time that global trade volume shrank after World War II. But in 2010, it swiftly recovered. And then you may think that, well, it was just something which was expected. But if we put ourselves in the context of 2008, it was not something logical. To a large extent, it was thanks to the measures taken by the G20 countries. And I think, so far as the short-term measures were concerned, G20 was very, very successful. Turning to long-term measures, then I think the general impression is, so far as the long-term measures are concerned, then G20 is not as effective as it was with respect to the short-term measures. And that is the reason why, David, you just said that G20 is struggling to show that it works. And then I think the question we should be asking ourselves would be this, which is it because of the shortcoming of the G20, or is it because of the nature of the long-term measures that it is taking longer for those long-term measures to come up with more, say, conspicuous outcomes? And I tend to believe it is more because of the nature of the long-term measures, not because of the shortcoming of G20, that it is taking longer. And let me try to elaborate a little bit on that theme. One of the long-term measures G20 leaders agreed to take was in the area of financial regulation. So for that, they charged an institution called Financial Stability Forum, or Financial Stability Board. It changed the name after the global financial crisis. Financial Stability Board to look into how to strengthen global financial regulation. And in fact, it came up with a package of measures to be taken in order to further strengthen international financial system. And those measures were agreed upon internationally, that is to say in the context of Financial Stability Board, but they are to be implemented in each and every one of those G20 member countries as well as in other countries. And by nature of strengthening financial regulation, it cannot but take time. Why? Because what we mean by strengthening financial regulation is like capital sufficiency ratio or leverage ratio, you cannot raise them overnight. It will depend upon your economic strength. It will depend upon the preparedness of your banking system. So it cannot but take longer, but it is happening. And then I can say the same thing with respect to, say, macroeconomic coordination. For macroeconomic coordination, they agreed upon something called framework, which was agreed upon in Seoul in 2010. And I can say almost the same thing with respect to the strengthening of international financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, etc., etc. And then for that, decision was already taken in order to change the quota, in order to, in a sense, elevate the status of emerging and developing countries in those international financial institutions. But at the same time, as I said, by the very nature of those measures, it is taking longer. But it is not to say the G20 is not working. So that is the reason why I think whether we look at short-term measures or long-term measures, for short-term measures, if I have to grade, then I would say A+. And then if I have to grade the long-term measures, then I would say A-. So on average, I think I will grade it A0.
Are you grading on a curve, or is this
on
absolute?
A curve,
okay.
on a curve, exactly.
No,
I used to teach, and then I was very strict about grading according to the curve.
Okay, so no grade inflation. You make a very important point. We often talk about the G20 as a monolith, as if it is a single collective entity. The critique is, the G20 hasn't done this or hasn't done that. And as you point out, the follow-through isn't just a matter of a thing called the G20 doing something. It's all of these individual governments or even connecting to other intergovernmental entities. Now, I'm going to leapfrog my friend Tom and go over to Liqun. Of course, China is the quintessential rising power, and China's strategy and objectives have been a topic on almost all of the panels that we've had. So as China looks at the multilateral system, the forces of disorder, its own rise, how do you think the Chinese view of the G20 is? And in particular, could you talk about the issue of internal economic rebalancing? If, as I was saying at the beginning, multilateral bodies are supposed to get governments to do things that they wouldn't otherwise doing. Is that an example?
Thank you, David. I think, generally speaking, China's view toward the G20 is quite positive. Since the very beginning of G20's ministerial meeting in 1999, China has been very actively involved in almost every meetings and every activities of ministerial level conferences and meetings. And China was very happy to see the G20 ministerial level meeting leveled to the highest, the summit meeting. And the President Hu Jintao participated almost all the summit meeting and promised to join hands with other countries to tide over difficulties and the crisis. Look at this speech he made in the first 2 or 3 summit meeting, and all topics are about join hands with others, or join efforts together to tide over difficulties that the current world facing. So China takes a very active view toward the G20. We believe that G20 is the most important international forum or framework or platform for the world to deal with the current crisis, the crisis and also challenges posed by the financial crisis and the economic crisis. I think we believe that economically, G20 can provide the platform for the whole world to deal with the difficulties and the challenges that we are facing. And also, this is the main vehicle for the leaders to meet together to discuss what are the problems is for the world economy, and to coordinate with each other, to cooperation with each other to cope with the problems. And politically, we believe this is quite important because China, as an emerging power, was invited to attend this G20 forum and to play some kind of role together with the major powers. This is quite welcome back home in China. And we also believe that the current international system is, generally speaking, is quite good for China to develop. If China can rise peacefully, and that China's development should be within the international system. That's why that China takes such kind of an active view toward the G20. And I think the G20 has done a great job, especially in dealing with the crisis. And this is a general view of Chinese, especially among the elite. Your question regarding the G20's agenda, if the G20 agenda is consistent with China's internal policy agenda, especially internal policy agenda set by the 12th Five-Year Plan. You know that every 5 years we have a plan. This has been since the very beginning of 1950. Now we are running 12th Five-Year Plan, and the fundamental task for this 12th Five-Year Plan is to restructure our economy, because the current economy is not sustainable. We have to restructure it because that our economic growth has been mainly relying on international trade and also asset investments, which is not very much healthy. So the 12th Five-Year Plan is aiming at restructuring our economy to provide more opportunities for internal consumptions and also technological innovation, and that will be decided for the next 20 years for China's development. So comparing the G20's agenda, especially the framework for strong and sustainable and balanced development, China also needs to balance our economy, especially balance economy, to reach balance between economy and society, between society and the men and the men and the men. Nature, society and nature, and the men and the men. And we have China now is facing a lot of difficulties. So this administration and also previous administration led by President Hu Jintao and Prime Minister Wen Jiabao, this administration led by President Xi Jinping and also Prime Minister Li Keqiang, they all determined to change such kind of imbalance. And this China's internal imbalance is very much closely linked with the international imbalance. So nowadays we are doing kind of a deeper reform and further opening up to address this imbalance issue. For China nowadays, we are doing three things. One is urbanization. And nowadays, you know, in China, that we have our urbanization percentage is about 51.3%. That means we still have a large space to further our urbanization. And urbanization will, in another 10 years, that 300 million of Chinese farmers will move to cities. Second thing is, which is related to the first urbanization, is that modernization of agriculture. Now we are going to do a land reform that will liberate thousands of millions of Chinese farmers, and they will move to cities, and their life will be very much improved by the reform, and then that will lift China's internal consumptions. And third thing is about the social project, which the Chinese government now has been doing. That means that we will reduce poverty as well as we are going to provide more social housing projects and also social welfare for farmers, and that will definitely lift internal consumptions, which will make the economy more balanced, and that will help the international society, especially the world economy, to be more balanced.
No, I know that social policy is something that the rest of the world is watching as an area to see what's happening, so that some of the savings that households accumulate to self-insure, in a sense, can be liberated through a social safety net.
Of course.
Now to Tom Wright, whom I'm aware is somewhat skeptical of the G20, and I know this because we've published an article together on the subject. And so I wonder where you see the G20 headed. I also know how much you focused on the Eurozone, where Tom comes from but hasn't lived in a while as an Irish expatriate. What has the Eurozone's challenges had to do with the G20?
Thank you, David. I'd like to thank the Asan Institute for putting on such a terrific conference and for inviting me here, and to thank David and my fellow panelists, and particularly just say to David that he's done just tremendous work in the US and really advancing Americans' knowledge of the G20, and has been responsible for many of the most productive forums, and so we've all learned a lot from those, I think, over the last 3 or 4 years of the financial crisis. If I may just take a step back to the first part before I get onto the Eurozone, because I think, we have, there's a difference between sort of process and the substance, and I think most of us agree on one, and I think the second is a little bit more contentious. And what I mean by that is there are two questions we can ask, right? The first question is, given the interests of all of the major economies, given the constraints that exist in each of those states, given the domestic politics in each of those states, is the G20 as an institution succeeding in basically squeezing out every last drop of cooperation that is possible to squeeze out of those countries in respect to the global economic crisis? And I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, I think the G20 is performing exceptionally well in that regard in terms of the economic crisis. Is it performing better than the G8 or the G7? I think so. Is it performing better than a more universal institution? I think it's pretty clear, that it does represent, 90% of, or over 80% of global GDP, and there have been a lot of crisis management measures that have had success, as my colleagues here have pointed out. So I think that, in terms of an institutional fix, I think we can say that the G20 has met that threshold. But there's a second question, which is, let's call it sort of the deinstitutionalized version of the question, right? And that question is, are the major economies doing what they need to do to strengthen the global economy or the international economic order? Like, quite apart from the tools that they use at the G20, since 2008, have they done enough to ensure that we won't face a future crisis, or that the global economy is recovering well, or in any what form you want to take it? And there, I think the judgment is a lot more mixed. And I think we need to sort of look at this in context. Right? We have now had approximately 20 years, 2 decades of an open global economy. This came from the old Western sort of international economy. After the Cold War, it was globalized to great fanfare and terrific success in bringing so many countries into the global economy and increasing growth. But it's also been pretty volatile and crisis prone. We've now had 2 major crises, one here in 1997 and a second originating in the United States in 2008. The second was worse than the first on a global basis. It was the worst since the 1930s. And there have been some measures to avert the collapse into a Great Depression. If you look at the charts tracking the two, the 2008 crisis is actually worse than the 1930 crisis until about 3 or 4 months in, at which point it begins to tick up, and that's, I think, down in part to the G20 response. But here's the point. Many of the fault lines that caused the crisis in the first place or caused the 97 crisis remain. Too big to fail banks, financial imbalances, lots of other sort of structural problems, what Raghu Rajan calls sort of the fault lines in the global economy, remain. And my only sort of point of skepticism, I guess, will be we're going to properly judge this period in the future. Like, historians are going to pass the judgment on this. And it will very much depend on what happens next. If this crisis is a once in a 50 years crisis and it doesn't reoccur, then I think everyone will look back and say the G20 did pretty well. You know, they came out better than they came out in the 1930s. It was sort of fine. If there's another crisis in 5 years' time, as in like every 10 years, 97, 2008, maybe 2017 or 2018, and if it's worse than the 2008 crisis, and if it actually is caused because of a failure to fix the fault lines in the global economy, then I think we'll look back on it in the way we look back in the interwar period, where we say, you know, well, these various pacts or treaties or League of Nations were good efforts, but complete failures. And so I don't know the answer to that. I very much hope it's the first, obviously. But I think that my sort of report card will be that the G20 as an institution has done very well, but that the leaders of the major states in the world need to up their game to try to fix the fundamental flaws in the international economic order to ensure it's stronger in the future.
I like the way you divided that question, right, between, on the one hand, the G20 succeeding in making what is possible happen, given the positions of the different governments, and separating that question then from the policy divergences themselves, right? And picking up on that, and I'd be interested in anyone's view on this. The Seoul summit came a few months after the Toronto summit. And the thing that I remember from the Toronto summit is that right before the summit, President Obama sent a letter to the other leaders basically saying, because he was concerned that the recovery was weak and fragile, that the G20 countries should not be in such a hurry to shift from stimulus, fiscal stimulus to help the global economy, to fiscal consolidation and balancing budgets, reducing deficits. So President Obama sent that letter, and the outcome of the Toronto summit basically was not what he was asking for. It shifted very heavily towards fiscal consolidation, withdrawing government stimulus. And so the question I want to ask is this. It seems to me that a lot of sort of the core issue of the recovery, there's been this major policy difference. And I want to know, as we assess the G20, how big of a factor that difference should be accounted for.
Well, David, that difference in basic economic conditions, and then that basic, the kind of constraint this difference in economic condition imposes upon every economy, then I think there was something taken for granted from the very beginning. When I say from the very beginning, I just look back upon all those Shorr meetings I used to attend in preparation for the London meeting, which happened in April 2009. At that time, as I recall, it was United States, Australia, and Korea, and Canada, which in fact was strongest in the view that we should be introducing stimulative measures as much as possible. And then European countries even at that time was very cautious about introducing stimulative measures. Why? Because of difference in fiscal conditions. So European countries, they were talking about automatic stimulators in the sense that, well, because they have better pension system, because all those automatic systems they already have in their system, without artificial measures in order to stimulate the economy, then in a sense, European economies would be able to better. And then the reason why they were making those arguments was because of this difference in the economic conditions. But David, let us think about the 3 points you made early on. And then the first point you made was, well, the criterion in order to tell if the system is failing or not, or succeeding or not, it is if the system is succeeding in making countries take the measures which they wouldn't without that system. That, in fact, would be the standard of review. And I think if you apply that to the G20 process, then I think we can say with a lot of confidence that, in fact, G20 member economies, they started from different economic conditions. So it is not surprising that they had to think about different policy tools. But even if given such constraints, as I see it, G20 economies were taking stimulative measures far more aggressively than they would have done without G20. So that is the reason why I was so generous in grading the G20.
And likewise, in terms of withdrawal of stimulus, you think it was more gradual than it would have been otherwise?
Right. If we just bring ourselves back to early month of 2009, it is just amazing because soon after the April summit of 2009, then we were already beginning to think about green shoots of recovery. That was amazing. It was even before 1 year since the financial crisis started in September 2008 that we already started to talk about green shoots of recovery. And then that is the reason why even before we had the Pittsburgh summit in November 2009, certain countries were beginning to talk about withdrawing some of the stimulation measures they had in place. And then why? Because the economy was picking up far earlier than expectation. And that, I think, but what is important is, even if some economies were beginning to think about withdrawing some of the measures they have taken in order to stimulate the economy, they were saying, as we coordinated when we went in, we should coordinate when we come out. Why? Because that way it will be more efficient. So that was strong sense of solidarity. There was strong sense of confidence in what the G20 can do for the world economy. And then that is the reason why, so far as the short-term measures were concerned, it was very positive. And then when it comes to long-term measures, I think it is more because of the nature of the long-term measures that it is taking longer time for us to see the outcome.
So that is an assessment that downplays some of the differences over
Exactly.
austerity.
Exactly.
And sounds like you're also turning the clock back and saying that maybe the recovery in the moment looked a little stronger than we later understood it to be. Turning to your colleagues, how would you view this? Austerity and budget cutting, fiscal consolidation is still controversial. There does seem to be some reassessment now that maybe weaknesses in the recovery are a result maybe of being too fast with withdrawal. How would you compare your judgment on this in terms of how the G20 countries did or how the G20 did as a forum?
Sure. So I think that there's a the reason why this is controversial is because these are deeply held beliefs. There's a real disagreement inside many of these countries about how best to proceed, whether it's stimulus or austerity, and then between countries. And it's a debate that has really been raging since 2008. I think the austerity school has gotten the better of the argument in general. Even when there have been governments like in the United States that have favored stimulus, has basically been restricted and constrained by domestic politics, by the Congress, and I don't think the stimulus is nearly as much as the president wanted it to be, and certainly not as long-term as that. I think the evidence is coming in that it has been that it has had unfortunate, consequences, and it has really constrained and limited growth. But I think that even though the debate is beginning to turn, and the most dramatic manifestation of that clearly was a couple of weeks ago with the coding error article on the Rogov-Reinhardt sort of paper, which sort of undermined the case for austerity when public debt went above 90%, that even so, I don't think there's going to be a major turnaround, because the question is, even if countries believe that austerity is a mistaken policy, are they willing to do the things necessary to put sort of stimulus into the economy? Are they willing to rebalance, internally, for instance? I mean, China gets some criticism in this regard, but frankly, Germany probably deserves, as much or more. And when Secretary Liu went to Europe last week, his main message was that there needs to be increased demand from German consumers. The Merkel government, I think, heard that, but didn't really pay attention, and I don't expect to see a major turnaround. So I think what we've learned is that austerity has deeply rooted support, and maybe more than many economists believed was the case at the beginning of this crisis. And it really does demonstrate that there are very severe political issues and political factors. So I think it will continue, but the $1 million question really is, where is the growth going to come from? And I think I won't address it in full here. I realize I didn't talk about it in the first question, but your question on the Eurozone, I would just say that that is a major drag on the global economy. When the world's largest economy is stuck in a slump at record unemployment and extremely low growth, even in the countries that are supposedly doing well, and that is going to have an effect on the rest of the world. And I think that's somewhere where the G20 has a particular interest, although it's very hard to get countries to do things that they don't want to do. So you can explain it in forms to Germany or others, but it doesn't mean that it's going to change.
That's a very important point, that the policies, the discussions that we see come into the multilateral setting, right, into the diplomacy of global economic cooperation, is a result of whatever the domestic politics are, right? I mean, you could switch the government control in a set of countries, and because they have opposite views on this question of how to recover, emphasize stimulus and spending, or focus on reducing deficits, that would give you a different outcome, at the multilateral level. Does China have similar internal divisions on, the focus on spending and stimulus, or austerity and budget balancing, or is there, pretty much a consensus?
No, I think today in China there is nothing easy for consensus building. We almost on every topic that we cannot reach consensus nowadays in China, not only domestic policies but also on foreign policies. This is quite true. In terms of the question you asked, that the current difficulties that the G20 is facing, and what kind of problems that are related with China and other countries. I think multilateral coordination of a multilateral policy is always difficult. Look at Europe. The European member states always find difficulties to reach consensus over either austerity or other stimulus policies for their economy. In China, it's the same thing. I think I very much agree with Ambassador An about these differences among G20 members. We have a lot of differences in terms of geographic, demographic, economic, and culture, and almost everything that make us very difficult to deal with the long-term issues, especially in terms of economic growth, job, and sustainable development, and all these things. So look at especially when the sense of urgency gradually abated, and the rise of diverging national interest in almost every country. I think China also has some differences among G20 members, especially in terms of economic development. For example, the United States emphasized the global imbalance, and they want to address this issue. And China, as I mentioned, that internally we are also facing this imbalanced development. But in the international affairs, especially when we are referring this global imbalance, the United States always emphasizes on the current account imbalance. But for China, we always emphasize development imbalance, especially between the South and North. This is a difference. And another issue, especially concerning the G20's role in the world, especially concerning G20's role in the reform of international financial system. So China is very much eager to see the reform of the institutions like IMF, and the emerging powers would like to see more power sharing, especially quota sharing, voting sharing with the economic, with the emerging powers based on the economic reality. But we have seen that the slowness of this process, especially the United States refused to donate money to the IMF. But this is a precondition for the IMF reform. So on other issue in terms of international trade, that China is very much looking forward to free trade. This is very much inconsistent with the developed countries, but the G20 talked on this anti-protectionism, but we see more rhetorics, but no actual actions taken by G20. So I see some kind of differences, especially the different emphasizes and the focuses on economic development. And this is something that we are facing now.
You wanted to add something? Go ahead.
Right. Well, there was a spring meeting of IMF in Washington, D.C. recently. And then one of the things we wanted to see happen in Washington, D.C. this time was IMF finance ministers say something against Abenomics. Mm-hmm. Because Abenomics, what it means is that very ambitious package of fiscal policy, monetary policy, and then structural reform, so that in order to boost the Japanese demand, but at the same time, the immediate impact of that would be a sudden drop in the exchange rate of Japanese yen. So we wanted IMF finance ministers to say something against it. But at the same time, on that account, there was a little bit of disappointment so far as Korean Minister of Finance was concerned, because what we came to see was overall support of Abenomics measures being taken in Japan. And I think Thomas just referred to this Rogoff article, and the Rogoff article came to be known well almost the same time as there was the IMF finance ministers meeting. And I said to myself, things are taking very interesting turn, because beginning from 2008, there has been this debate between austerity and stimulus. And then the way I look upon it is this, which is that there are increasing number of governments, increasing number of academics who are taking the side that austerity can wait. What we need at this time is stimulus. Well, so far as governments are concerned, then I think all the 27 member countries of the European Union, they were more on the side of austerity back in 2009. Now it looks, well, Germany is there, Netherlands is there, but they are losing the number of countries supporting their ideas of putting that much more emphasis upon austerity. I think there are increasing number of even European countries who are thinking austerity can wait. So when we really, what we really need is the measures we should be taking in order to stimulate our economy. And I think that change in the composition of countries is being reflected in the academic world as well. So that, I think, forms the broad basis or broad background, the Rogoff article. So with all of these developments taking place in countries as well as in the academic community, the real question we have to ask ourselves once again would be the first criterion you introduced for us, which is G20 helpful in making countries take measures which they wouldn't without the G20? And I think G20 is definitely helpful on that particular account. Well, David, I was just wondering if we could move to another related subject, which is Liqun. She mentioned something very interesting, which is, well, one of the things which G20 is doing for China, well, China, broadly speaking, is in support of G20, and then China is proud to be part of the G20. And then overall, the impact G20 is having for China is to help it to rise peacefully, then in a threatening manner. Then I think it's a very important point Liqun was pointing to, in the sense that I think it is only when you make countries to participate in the process that they will turn to have more interest and then stake in the whole system, and that way they become more constructive. And I think Liqun is pointing to a very important point, which is a process like G20 and discussions they're having in a forum like G20, where Hu Jintao was very statesmanlike throughout the whole process. He was very statesmanlike. And then we expect Xi Jinping to play the same role in the years to come. And then what I understand is that China very much wishes to host G20 summit meeting in China as well. And I think it will be another opportunity if China ends up by hosting a G20 summit meeting in China. It will be another opportunity through which China will become even more helpful as a leader in the G20 process. And I think this presence of China in the G20 process would, in fact, as Liqun has said, help China to rise peacefully rather than in a different manner. So that, I think, this geopolitical impact of G20 is another consideration that we should be making when we view and then try to assess the G20 process.
You know, often we hear Chinese colleagues expressing ambivalence about taking a lead role, right? Don't expect too much from a rising China. Don't forget the internal challenges we have. You know, we won't be able to do so much, be so active all the time. But do you feel, Liqun, that experience in a setting like G20 does change the consciousness a little bit in terms of China being right in there as a key player?
I think China will be maintaining the momentum to be involved in G20, that's for sure. And this is the very important international institutions, especially established after the end of the Cold War. So China attaches great importance to this G20 because we can make our voice heard in this international decision-making mechanism. I'm sure that China will, of course, I agree what you said, that China is always reluctant to be taking a lead. And we like to say that let us keep low profile, not taking lead. That's very much true. I think for a while that China will still maintaining such kind of attitude toward the international affairs. This is a policy coming out of China's reality. Yesterday, I heard Professor Jia Qingguo from Beijing University to talk about China's duality of China's identity. This is very much true also. China is a developing country as well as developed in some areas, in some regions. And China is sometimes feeling strong, sometimes feeling weak. because of the internal problems. We are confronting a lot of challenges at home. That's why the Chinese leader always look at the internal affairs as the first priority of their policy consideration. For quite a long time, that China will be like that. But we have to play more important role in G20 because China hopes to develop ourselves, especially to maintain 7% of development for another 10 years, so that China can realize our national objectives. And this is clearly written in Chinese political documents like 18th of Chinese Communist Party's Congress. So the international market is so important for China, still important for China. International trade accounts for the large share of Chinese GDP growth. So even though we know that China's current task is to restructure our economic structure and also lift internal consumptions, but the international trade and investment is still very much important. So that's why I'm going to say that for internal debate, our debate is not very much on austerity or stimulus, but on how to reach balance between the government and society. And that's very important debate going on in China.
The large number of state-owned enterprises, I guess, being one of those issues. But of course, you're right. And we're saying this about so many issues that it's difficult, right? China's rise, and especially China's economic growth and development, has very much been fueled by exports, right? And so now this is a discussion about rebalancing for domestic consumption, for consumer demand. And at many times in our discussion, and I want to make sure to leave some time and get questions and comments from the audience here, but we seem to have heard a number of times in the discussion about the difficulties of some of these issues. Ambassador, on your initial assessment about the long-term agenda of the G20 is that it is less a failing of the G20 and more the inherent difficulty of some of the things that are trying to be done. And I think that's important. It's not that we should grade the G20 on a curve, coming back to the idea of grading, but maybe it's more like some events at the Olympics, with the degree of difficulty, that goes into the calculation for diving or for figure skating. I think there is very much a varying degree of difficulty for these different issues. It's hard to know how to judge. Just one more point, coming back to that trade protectionist measure standstill. Commitment has been there from the beginning of the summits in 2008, 2009, and all the way through for G20 governments not to take trade protectionist measures. But of course, they are taking trade protectionist measures, as we can see.
Right.
Does that mean that the G20 has failed? Well, one of the ways that people talk about degree of difficulty is to say, well, some protectionist measures have been taken, but maybe a lot more. Maybe there would be a lot more protectionism if there had not been the commitment and the statement, because sure enough, if you compare protectionism today to the 1930s, no comparison. So much less today. So if we think that the 1930s scenario is still possible, then maybe the G20 has actually succeeded in reducing trade protectionism. So it's not easy to reach definitive judgments of these things, and I think I would propose that it's only fair to do so when you look at each of the things that it's trying to do and seeing what's involved, whether it's complex matter, who it depends on for follow-through, what are the political disagreements, what are the domestic roots of those political disagreements. So hopefully we've given enough, we've stimulated you enough to have some reactions, and we would love to hear them. The microphone is on its way.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate Ambassador Kim's suggestion for China to host one of the G20 summit. One possibility is 2016. However, Japan has expressed its desire very strongly to host the 2016 summit. So the issue is, it is still in limbo. Whether which country of that group of countries, China or Japan, will host that summit. My question is, based on your assessment so far, do you have, the panel, do you have any expectations of this year's summit in St. Petersburg, Russia? And how do we measure the degree of success or the degree of failure of G20 summit? Thank you.
Please, any responses not only to the question, but I also think it might be interesting to talk about this question of Japan versus China as a hosting nation, because it is a very interesting one, both in terms of the economic issues involved, but it's also sort of it's an interesting geopolitical sort of situation, isn't it, as well? So on either or both of those questions of how we how we're going to judge success or failure of the St. Petersburg or any other summit, and then this question of a host. Mm-hmm. Do you want to start?
Well, with respect to the point you have about Japan and China being in the same group, then of course Korea is also in the same group. Mm-hmm. And I think beginning from the first summit in 2008, Japan was very explicit in expressing its wish to host the G20 summit meeting. And then for one reason and another, it didn't happen. So it just turned out to be the fact that Korea just happened to be the first country to host the G20 summit. So in that sense, Liqun, she was just talking about reluctance of China to be in the leading role on international issues. So the impression I have is that Korea is in the habit of punching above weight, and China is in the habit of punching below weight. I don't know which one is better. But at the same time, I'm well aware of Japanese wish, and then of course we will have to see how it all ends up. But at the same time, I think it is very positive for the G20, as well as for the relations in Northeast Asia, as well as in the global context, that there are increasing number of countries who wish to host the G20 summit. Because one of the questions which raised by you, David, was if it will continue, if it will be a sustainable G20 process. And then I think the fact that so many countries wish to host the G20 summit meeting, I think it will be one of the signs that it is well and alive and kicking. So that, I think, is a good sign. With respect to what standard can we apply to the success or failure of the St. Petersburg summit, then I wish to get back to the point I made earlier on, which was the difference between short-term measure and then the long-term measure. And I think when we were preparing for the Seoul summit, then we were still recovering from the crisis. It was the early days of the crisis. But even then we were saying, well, 70% or 80% of our efforts in Seoul, when we prepare for the summit meeting in Seoul, would be focused upon implementation. And then we would be extremely cautious in introducing new measures. Why? Because we didn't want to overburden the G20 process. Because if we overburden the process, the risk we'd be running would be, well, more burden you take, then you will make yourself more vulnerable to negative assessment. That is the first reason. And the second reason was, more importantly, we thought already there were a large number of important decisions taken. And then what was important to see to it was to ensure that those agreements would be implemented. And I think that would be the same standard that we should be applying to the G20 summit meeting in St. Petersburg.
I'd just like to make a comment, I guess, on St. Petersburg, but also the general role of the G20 and avoid the China or Japan question, if I may. I don't have huge expectations for the St. Petersburg summit or for the Russian sort of hosting of the G20. I think that's partly because Russia itself has sort of pulled the ambition of the G20 back a little bit from what Mexico had before, or maybe what Australia might have in the next year. Or so I think that there's it will be more modest. But that said, it's still an important meeting. And I think one of the things that's sort of interesting, and this goes back a little bit to one of the earlier comments about China as a responsible stakeholder in the system and the G20 facilitating that, is that what we've actually seen since 2008, 2009 has been deepening cooperation between the major powers in the global economy, but relations between major powers and other issues have actually deteriorated. Now, I don't think there's a connection between those two, but I think what it does highlight is that we are living in a world in which there's going to be greater competition on many of these sort of security or tough sort of, national interest issues, everything from maritime disputes here in the, Asia-Pacific region to, with Russia, relations between Putin and Obama are probably as bad as they've ever been. At the same time, there's going to be deep cooperation on the global economy. And the question, I think, for the G20 is how to preserve or ring-fence the cooperation in the global economy from the other problems. I wish it was the case that the cooperation in the global economy would spill over to other areas. I don't think that will happen, unfortunately, but I do think there's a risk it could work in reverse. And so I think one function of the G20 is that. Also, the G20 is emerging as a place where leaders can meet in the absence of other bilateral ties. The new president of China and President Obama, I believe their first meeting will be at a G20 meeting later this year. I found out recently that President Putin and President Obama have only met once, actually, on the margins of a similar meeting before. And I wonder if there's a way to try to make more use of these meetings to increase the amount of time for bilaterals between the leaders. I know there's some bilaterals at the moment, but I don't think that they are sort of sufficient in terms of the time put in. So I wonder if there's a way to sort of build in mini summits on the sidelines in a more substantive way, and that could be a way of increasing the added value of the summits.
Of course, that would be at the expense of plenaries. It would be at the expense of of the group having time together. So there's trade. That's a zero sum unless the summits can be made longer. Liqun, did you want to come on?
Let me say this: no matter which country is going to convene 2016 G20. I think that we have to learn from South Korea, because Seoul G20 summit is wonderful. It's fantastic, and South Korea has done a great job. I think we have a lot of things to learn from them. And about the St. Petersburg G20 summit. I think two things are the keys for G20's further development. That is issue focus or agenda focus, and also the leadership. And these two things are the key for maintaining the G20's momentum to keep going on. So agenda focus, I prefer that the growth and job and also together with the trade should be very much focused in St. Petersburg because the world is still struggling in economic recessions and difficulties. And the leadership, I would like to see Russian playing a leading role, tough role in this regard. But let us see. We will see. It's still difficult to predict it will be success or not.
Thanks. What I'd like to do now is to take a number of questions all at once before responses. So let's over here.
My name is Yong Jung from Asan Academy, and my question is like the before Thomas Wright sir said that if the failure of current international monetary system, the crisis occur because of failure of current international monetary system, then what will be the future G20 and what is your country will do in that conditions?
Thank you. Any other questions? Please.
Thank you. My name is Ho-Jin Yoon, and I'm a first Asan Young Fellow. And my question is, Mr. Ambassador An said about Abenomics, and in 2008, the U.S. also released money to stimulate their economy. And how could a middle power like Korea could track the big powers' monetary policy?
Okay, are all the questions going to be about monetary policy? Please go ahead. It's okay if they are.
Thank you for all the good talks. My name is Ji Shin, and I'm from Young Scholars. My question is regarding the recent yen crisis. I was wondering if the manipulation of the currency could be seen as a shortcoming of G20, and if there is any improvement on that issue. Thank you.
I have one more. Yeah. When in the geopolitical view, what do you think in the future the Middle East and those like the Ho-Jin said, mid power or the South African and also the Latin American and the Middle East area will do on the G20? What do you see? I want to your aspect or view.
Can you repeat the question? I don't think.
This is about regional representation in the membership of the G20. We have one African, one sub-Saharan African country, one north. Yeah. Okay. Who would like to go first?
You
Thomas?
go first, Ambassador, because this is about middle power.
Right. Where I came to find that so many questions were focused upon, manipulation of currency. And I think to a large extent, so far as the middle powers are concerned, there is very little we can do about it. But at the same time, I think there has been an analogy. And an analogy is, even if influenza is around, if you keep yourself healthy, then there is a better chance that you can withstand it. And then middle powers, I think so far as the middle powers are concerned, that may be the best. Earlier on, I just told you about our expectation in the spring meeting of the IMF. And then we really expected IMF finance ministers to take certain actions with respect to all those measures being taken under the name of Abenomics. And then there was a little bit of disappointment in the sense that it didn't happen. But at the same time, what I recall is this is not the very first time that we have adverse movement in exchange rate between Korean currency and then Japanese yen. What I recall is just before the crisis in 2008, in 2007, for example, the exchange rate between Japanese yen and the US dollar was 120 yen to $1. Now it appreciated to 80 yen to $1. So we would just wonder, which is the, well, in a sense, appropriate exchange rate between Japanese yen and then US dollar. Because between 120 in 2007 and then 80 of today, then there is a wide ranging margin, and then we would just wonder if 100 is too high. for the Japanese yen. So that is the first point. My second point would be this, which is that, as I already said, this is not the very first time that we have this problem between Japanese yen and then Korean won. One time frame I have in mind is 2004, 2005. At the time, I was on deputation to the Minister of Finance and Economy at the time. I have worked for the Minister of Foreign Affairs for a long time, but for 1.5 years in 2004 and 2005, I was on deputation to the Minister of Finance and Economy. And then same thing happened at the time. Korean currency was appreciating vis-a-vis US dollar as well as Japanese yen. Somehow it didn't have too much adverse impact upon our trading activities. And then that time, we were just wondering in the Korean Minister of Finance and Economy, how could we explain this relative, little impact that this apparently adverse exchange rate movement is having upon the performance of the Korean economy. And then, as I said, well, as middle power, we cannot do very much about, say, QE or other measures large economies are taking, which can have impact upon the exchange rate. But at the same time, there are a large number of measures we can take in order to survive those measures being taken in large economies. Just as an anecdote, in 2009, there was an IMF forecast which said Korean economy would be shrinking by 3 or 4% because of the global financial crisis in 2009. Early in 2010, the Great Report came out, and then Korean economy grew by 0.5%. 0.5% is not huge growth, but at the same time, between minus growth of 3 to 4% and plus growth of 0.5%, there's a big difference of between 3 or 4%. So we had to wonder why that was the case. And then we could come up with several explanations. One of them was the financial crisis of 1997. Thomas just mentioned about the double whammy of Asian financial crisis in 1997 and the global financial crisis of 2008. What I truly think is we, in a sense, owe a lot to the Asian financial crisis of 1997 for the fact that we could go through the global financial crisis of 2008 with relatively little difficulties. Why? Because Korean economy underwent very serious economic reform, restructuring, in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis at the time. There were several other reasons, but it, I think, was an important reason. And then there is the reason why I'm confident that irrespective of these movements in exchange rates, hopefully Korean economy would not be affected in serious manner.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and I have the ambition of ending on time, given how impressed I've been with the rest of the punctuality. So I want to, your few last points from the other panelists before we conclude.
One of the questions was, what's the future of the G20 and the global economy? I guess if there's not major reform, and I think when we think about the currency issues or other actions that states may take that aren't in the global good or are seen as sort of particularly advantaging themselves, I think the thing to remember is that all of these are basically in a category of strategies which are hedging against the risk of the global economy. I mean, if you believe that this is a crisis-prone system, then you are going to try to take unilateral measures to protect your economy from that risk. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I think we'll see that progressively. The longer the G20 or the world's most powerful economies do not and visibly address the fault lines at the heart of the global economy, then the more the countries will engage in unilateral hedging mechanisms. Now, the tariff and protectionist issue, I think, is a little bit of a red herring. It's constantly brought out by world leaders to say how well they're doing. But I don't think that that is under serious consideration anywhere. The real issues have more to do with the financial system, with sort of banking, with some of the currency issues, with reserves, which is a big consequence of the 97 crisis. That countries want to be to be able to rely on themselves. They want to have self-reliance in response to a crisis. They don't want to rely on the G20. They don't want to rely on other countries because they see that there is a decreased appetite to bail others out or to engage in cooperative measures. So if we continue on the current course, I think what we're going to see is two things. One is we're going to see more unilateralism. Everyone will still go to the G20, they'll still try to agree certain things, but they will also be spending a lot of intellectual capital in their capitals thinking about how to hedge against. And then just a very final point is that I think we'll also see concern that a new crisis could emerge. Maybe it's from China, maybe it's again in the United States or somewhere else, but that danger is very much not gone away.
Liqun.
Regarding this representation issue, I think one of the key issues for G20 is to reach balance between the legitimacy and effectiveness. Current strategy, especially outreach strategy of G20, is pretty good in this way to solve this issue. In terms of middle power, I don't think that South Korea is a middle power. It's becoming a major power in this region. In terms of soft power, look at the yesterday evening's performance. It's a great combination between combination of a piano and Korean traditional music instrument. I like that performance very much. I think this is a kind of a show that South Korea is becoming a major power.
Thank you. Returning to this question of the short term versus the long term, I think so many different short term issues have continued to be concerns. It's in one sense we've left the crisis, but the recovery has been, so uncertain and fragile. And then with the debates over austerity, and you point out that maybe there has been a shift in that way. You can almost see the center of gravity shifting. But the Eurozone issue, these immediate concerns have definitely taken a lot of time at the summits. And that's why it always is strange to me, this notion that there's distraction by other issues, that the process is in danger of being overwhelmed by these kind of side matters. And I don't quite understand that threat, because I think we know that by and large those matters don't take the same amount of time. If there's a danger of the G20 being overwhelmed, personally what I see is that whether it's an economic issue or whether it's more of a political issue, the danger is about sort of treading water, a lot of shuffling of paper without anything, real movement forward. And so that would be my answer to the question of how we know that there's success, is that if issues are progressing, that whatever the topic, the summit communique doesn't say the same thing over and over again. Perhaps the most interesting moment on trade issues was when the G20 said they're not so sure about completing the Doha round, after again and again and again saying we're going to complete the Doha round, then finally saying, maybe we aren't, because we haven't been getting anywhere with that. But my thanks to my fellow panelists for an excellent discussion. So please join me in expressing our appreciation.